443,000 hard drives, more than 1.5 million drive years of running time, logged across 12 years by cloud storage company that publishes its raw data, then handed to two economists who ran the numbers properly, controlling for age, temperature, and capacity. Christoph Seamroth and Yomiyoung Park published the result in a peer-reviewed IEEE journal, and TechSpot wrote it up on the 16th of August. HDSD drives failed at roughly 41% of Seagate's rate, Western Digital at about 52%, Toshiba at 107. And the line that stuck with me: every additional degree Celsius of average drive temperature raised the failure rate by 2.1%. I'm not here to tell you which disk to buy. That study is really about something else. It says, with more statistical care than anyone has managed before, that the storage under your desk has a failure probability. Somebody has measured it, and the number is not zero. Which makes this the week to keep the promise I made last episode. Today we're doing backups. I've been dreading this one slightly, because backups are the broccoli of this hobby. Everyone agrees they matter. Almost nobody does them properly, and the reason is friction rather than ignorance. Ask a room of technically capable people whether their files are backed up, and most answers begin with the word basically. Basically, they're on OneDrive. Basically, I copied everything to a disk at Christmas. That word is doing enormous work, and what it means is, I have an intention, not a system. So let me sharpen the problem before I name a tool. Syncing is not backing up. If a folder on your laptop mirrors a folder in the cloud, and you delete a file, or software corrupts it, or ransomware encrypts it, the cloud faithfully replicates that damage within seconds. That is a mirror, not a time machine. What you want is versioned, encrypted, deduplicated snapshots, held somewhere your main machine cannot casually destroy, taken on a schedule you did not have to remember, with something that tells you when they stop happening. Two of those words, half a sentence each. A snapshot is a complete picture of your files at a moment in time, restorable as a whole. Deduplication means every snapshot after the first stores only the blocks that changed. So a daily snapshot of 100 gigabytes does not cost 100 gigabytes a day. The mature open source answer to most of that is a program called restic. Genuinely excellent. A single-go binary, 35,500 stars, encrypted and deduplicated by design, and it writes to almost any storage you can name, including cheap object storage, a plain external disk, or a server over SSH. Its most recent release, version 0.19.1 in early July, followed a substantial 0.19 in June that fixed access control inheritance on Windows restores and tightened its handling of duplicate index entries. This show has mentioned restic before, and I am not pretending otherwise. But restic has one gap that explains almost every failed backup story I have ever heard, and it is a design decision rather than a bug. Restic ships no scheduler of its own. Its documentation's automation example is a systemd unit file you are expected to write yourself. There is no dashboard, no notification system, and nothing to tell you that last Tuesday's backup silently did not run. That is the gap. And the project that fills it, which is today's deep dive, is called Backrest. Backrest is a web interface and an orchestrator for restic. Its own description is refreshingly unpretentious. A web interface that wraps the restic command line and makes it easy to create repositories, browse snapshots, and restore files, plus a background service taking what the author calls an opinionated approach to scheduling snapshots and orchestrating repository health operations. It ships as a single lightweight binary whose only dependency is restic, and if restic is not already on your machine, it downloads a compatible copy on first run. You install it, open a browser, a local port, and it asks you to set a username and password. That is the whole onboarding. Here is why it deserves the deep dive slot rather than a passing mention. Every tool in this category solves the cryptography and the deduplication. Almost none solve the human problem, which is that backups fail quietly. Backrest goes at that directly. You define a plan, which folders on what schedule, how long to keep the snapshots, say daily for a week and weekly for a month. Then also schedules the maintenance jobs people forget exist. Forget, which marks old snapshots for deletion. Prune, which reclaims the space. And check, which verifies the data in your repository is still readable. The single most neglected operation in amateur backup practice. It sends failure notifications to Discord, Slack, Godify, or health checks, and runs shell commands before and after a backup, so you can dump a database first. In the July release, version 1.14 did something I want to single out because it tells you what the project values. It redesigned the summary dashboard, and the author called that redesign, in the release notes, reassurance first. The same release taught the dashboard to display overdue, missed backups, and the icon in your system tray to reflect backup status. Not new cryptography, not a new storage backend. A better answer to the question, is this actually still working? The storage side is inherited wholesale from restic, which is the real reason to build on it. Point Backrest at Backblaze B2, at Amazon S3, or anything that speaks its protocol, at Azure, at Google Cloud, at an SFTP server, at a folder on a USB disk, or at any of the hundreds of destinations rclone supports, which quietly turns Dropbox, Google Drive, and OneDrive into backup targets. One more feature worth naming is multi-host sync, which lets several installations report their history to each other, so you can watch 3 machines from one screen. How it authenticates, that is a detail I enjoyed. You generate a pairing token with a time to live, a maximum number of uses, and an explicit permission set. The client spends it once, and after that the two ends authenticate by public key identity. If you heard the last episode, where one long-lived, reusable network key let an automated intruder enroll 181 machines into a company's private network, you will recognize the pattern. Short-lived, scoped, single-use credentials, and a hobbyist backup tool. That is security culture trickling downhill in the right direction. Now the case against, because you should not trust me if I only give you one side. First, and most important, this is effectively a one-maintainer project. Over 700 of the contributions to that repository come from one person, and the next name on the list has 10. There are over 300 open issues. That is not a scandal. It is the normal shape of a small, healthy project, and we talked frankly about exactly this risk with the home server platform in the first episode. But go in knowing it. The mitigation here is unusually strong. Backrest is a wrapper, so your data does not live in a Backrest format. It lives in a standard restic repository. If the project stopped tomorrow, your backups would still be readable by the restic command line, and by rustic, an independent Rust implementation that reads the same repositories and shipped a release on the 18th of August. Very few tools give you an exit that clean. Second, if you want scheduling built into the engine rather than bolted on top, that exists, and it is called Copia. Its own scheduling, its own encryption with user-controlled keys, its own official graphical interface, roughly 14,000 stars. A legitimate alternative, and I will not pretend otherwise. My read, and this is preference rather than fact, is that the restic ecosystem is the one I would bet my own files on, because the format has more independent implementations and a longer track record, and Backrest gives you that ecosystem without writing cron jobs. If you would rather run one program in 2, take Copia and be happy. And if you were about to ask about Borg, excellent at deduplication, its stable line got a release in July, and its version 2 has been in beta since August 2022 for years and 22 beta releases. I admire it. I will not start there today. Third, the small print. The most recent patch, 1.14.1, exists because retention and forget operations were being silently skipped, precisely the class of bug you least want in a backup tool. The fair reading is a mixture of they found and fixed it fast, and this is young software. It binds to your local machine only by default, which is right, and if you want to reach it from another room, put it behind an authenticating reverse proxy rather than opening the port. And its own documentation carries a warning worth saying aloud. The same trap we hit with encrypted photos last episode. Lose your repository password and encryption key, and your backups are unrecoverable. Put them in your password manager before the first snapshot, not after. So what is the effort? On Windows, there's an installer that drops in the program, plus a tray application that starts with your session. On macOS, there's an app and a homebrew tab. On Linux, an install script that sets up a service, or a Docker image if you prefer. Realistically, download to first working scheduled encrypted offsite backup is one evening. Most of it spent watching something else while the first upload runs. The maintenance burden after that is close to 0, which is the entire point. And the trajectory, since this show is willing to make a case rather than just describe things. The repository sits at just over 7,000 stars, which is modest. But it took 56 commits in the last 2 months. Releases landed steadily through February, May, and July. Its binaries have been downloaded 101,000 times, and its Docker image has been pulled 4.5 million times. That gap between star count and real usage tells you something. My read is that Backrest is the quiet infrastructure layer this category has been missing, and that it gets talked about less than it deserves because it is unglamorous, not because it is unproven. High confidence recommendation if you have any always-on machine and any offsite storage. That is the deep dive for quick hits. First, a project has died and nobody announced it. CasaOS, the layer that turned a spare computer into a friendly home server with an app store, 37,000 stars, one of the best known on ramps into this hobby, was quietly removed from the awesome self-hosted list on the 9th of August. The removal note is the coldest thing I read all fortnight. An automated linter reporting the project had not been updated in 368 days, past the list's 1-year threshold, and a human adding that the last release was already 2 years ago. To be scrupulously fair, the repository is not archived and nobody has declared anything. The last commit is from August of last year. The last release that was not an alpha is from December 2024. In the first episode, we asked what happens when a home server platform depends on one team's continued attention. This is the answer in its commonest form, which is not a shutdown notice, it is silence. If CasaOS is the thing standing between you and your files, start planning. Second, if you host your own code, this is your week for maintenance. GitLab shipped an emergency patch on the 17th of August, outside its normal schedule, for a critical flaw rated 9.4 out of 10. Under certain conditions, an unauthenticated user, meaning someone who is not logged in at all, could remotely modify or delete public projects and user data through a GraphQL directive. Self-managed installations only. GitLab's own hosted service was already patched. The fixed versions are 19.2.4, 19.1.6, 19.0.8, and 18.11.11, and the affected range reaches all the way back to 18.2. Do it today. And the counterpoint from the same week. GitHub itself fell over on the 17th for 7 hours and 47 minutes, taking down the website, authentication, actions, the APIs, pull requests, and issues, after what its own postmortem calls a critical infrastructure component in its central U.S. data center failing to scale with a new traffic peak. Their second capacity failure of the month. The lesson from both stories together is not go and host your own Git forge, which is a real commitment. It is smaller. Your code and your project history live on a computer you do not control, and one command, git clone with a mirror flag, gives you a complete local copy of every branch and tag. Run it against the repositories you would miss, and put the result inside the backup you just set up. Third, Planka, a Kanban board of the sort people use instead of Trello, 12,500 stars. Shipped version 2.2 on the 9th of August, and moved single sign on out of its community edition into the paid tier. Read the breaking changes first because they are unusually sharp. After updating, every user who signed in through single sign-on is deactivated, since they no longer have a password to log in with. And if your only administrator account was one of those, you are locked out of your own board. The weekly recap covered the wider pattern, which the community has started calling the single sign-on tax, and made the fair point that unpopular is not the same as illegitimate. You are not entitled to features of software you never paid for. I would add that it stings more when a capability is taken away than when it was never offered. There is a second reason to be watching Planka. The very next day, they shipped 2.2.1, an emergency release fixing a path traversal flaw in some static file routes, where an authenticated user on an instance using local file storage could read arbitrary files the Planka process could read. Object storage instances were unaffected. Update either way. Fourth, a deadline I gave you last time is coming due. File Browser, the 35,000-star web file manager, is scheduled to be archived on the 1st of September, which is 9 days away. Last episode, one pointed you at the actively maintained fork, File Browser Quantum, and that advice stands. This fortnight, XDA published a piece by Yash Patel about taking a different route entirely, to a project called Filestash, which is a universal file client rather than a browser for one folder. 14,500 stars, AGPL licensed, updated 2 days ago, and the interesting part is the range of things it sits in front of: FTP, SFTP, Web, S3, Minio, Git, Dropbox, Google Drive. So the choice is clear enough. If you want the experience you already had, take the fork. If what you actually wanted was one browser tab reaching every storage system you own, look at Filestash, and note the author's honest caveats about thumbnail glitches and the extra setup document editing requires. The GitHub Trending Pulse, our quick tour of what is climbing, same caveat as last time. The page is still close to wall-to-wall artificial intelligence tooling, so I am picking the exceptions. The runaway story is OpenLogi, a native rewrite of Logitech's mouse and keyboard software in Rust, up nearly 5,000 stars in a week to 14,000. It remaps buttons, drives sensor resolution, and controls scroll wheel behavior, keeps its settings in a plain text file you own, runs on all 3 desktop systems, and in its own words has no account and no telemetry, though its README is honest that it is not yet stable. Omarki, a highly opinionated Linux desktop, added 3,000 stars on a version 4 release, and a new nonprofit foundation funded with $8 million from 8 patrons at $1 million each, including the chief executives of Stripe, Cloudflare, and Dell. A tool called OmFit gained nearly 2,000 stars for answering one practical question in one command: which language models will actually run on your hardware? And Google Timeline Visualizer took 400 stars in a day for turning exported location history into a map of your own year. One continuity note: the diagram library from the last episode's Pulse has passed 25,000 stars, adding 7,000 this week alone, so that rocket has not run out of fuel. Now, the practical part, and this fortnight, it is unusually concrete. Picture a household many of you will recognize. 2 or 3 computers, one more or less always on and doing real work, files spread across a couple of commercial cloud accounts, an external drive plugged in occasionally with good intentions, and no automated backup anybody could describe without using the word basically. First priority, and I want to be blunt about the order: install a backup orchestrator on the machine that is already always on, and give it one plan tonight. Not your whole life. One plan pointed at the folders you would actually grieve for. Documents, photos not already duplicated elsewhere, and the configuration and scripts that would take a weekend to reconstruct. Send it to cheap object storage. At Backblaze's published rate of $6.95 per terabyte per month, half a terabyte offsite costs under $4 a month, and the first 10 gigabytes are free, which is enough to prove the whole thing works before you spend anything. Schedule it daily. Set retention to a week of daily snapshots and a month of weekly ones, and turn on failure notifications to wherever you actually look, which for most people is a phone rather than email. Second priority, and this is the step almost everyone skips, restore something. Not a drill, not a plan to do it later. This week, open the snapshot browser, pick one file you recognize, restore it to a scratch folder, and open it. A backup you have never restored from is a hypothesis. Then repeat that check once a quarter and put a repeat calendar entry in now while you're thinking about it. And while you are there, write the repository password and encryption key into your password manager, because encrypted backups you cannot decrypt are just expensive noise. Third, the second copy. The old convention in this trade is 3 copies of your data on 2 kinds of media, one of them offsite, and it survives because it is right. If you already keep an external drive, you have 2 of the 3, and the offsite repository from step 1 completes it. The same tool drives both destinations on different schedules. And if your external disk backup is a folder full of copied files, remember that is a mirror rather than a history. So consider making it a proper snapshot repository instead. Fourth, the housekeeping in deadline order. Self-managed GitLab gets patched today. Planka users update to 2.2.1. Reading the sign-on warning before you upgrade rather than after. File browser users have until the 1st of September to pick a successor, the fork or Filestash. And if you run anything on that abandoned home server platform, this is the fortnight to plan your move rather than the fortnight to discover the problem. And what not to do. Do not go shopping. If this episode has you eyeing a shiny mini server or a network storage box, look at memory prices first. Tom's Hardware reported this month that a standard 64 gigabyte kit costing under $200 last summer now costs over $1,100, with prices up around 500% across the year. This is the worst quarter in recent memory to buy computer hardware. And the good news is that everything above runs on a machine you already own and a storage bucket that costs less than a sandwich. Software wins are the wins available right now. Let the memory market calm down before you spend anything on silicon. That is the brief. A peer-reviewed reminder that disks are mortal, a backup orchestrator that makes the best engine in open source run without you, a much-loved home server project gone quiet, a critical GitLab patch, and a deadline 9 days out. If you have a restore story, triumphant or catastrophic, put it in the comments. The catastrophes teach the rest of us most. Next time, the biggest remaining hole in most setups, getting off Google Drive and Dropbox properly without the enormous suite every other show recommends. Until then, go and restore one file.